Well, for more on this, we're joined by Jamie Jenkins, who is the former head of health at the Office for National Statistics. Jamie, thanks so much for your time this evening. Do appreciate it. I was listening to Chris Brazier this evening, and you know, when we talk about selective statistics, it's impossible when there are so many statistics in play not to select certain ones ahead of others. What do you think we ought to be keeping our ears peeled for?
Well, Colin, we're a few weeks behind other parts of the world. Obviously, South Africa, Denmark have seen a huge rise in cases as well, and I've been quite critical of some of the slides that have been presented over the last year. And if we look at what the facts and figures are showing at the moment, we've seen a slight bump up in England in the number of kind of people in hospital over the last few days, but that comes off one of the longest declines we've seen in kind of patients in hospital since the back end of last winter. So they're creeping up slowly, but the majority of them are coming in the London area. And that seems to be where this kind of Omicron variant's driving up now. It's too early for the Omicron variant to be leading to these hospitalizations. So the information coming out of South Africa that it might be kind of less deadly and lead to you going in is probably the thing that we might want to keep an eye out for. It's probably more of a case of that we've just seen cases going up over the country as well. Now, in Scotland and in Wales, where obviously the First Minister in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, was urging people not to kind of congregate and get together and think about who you mix with now over the next few weeks. And there's rumours of potential bubbles coming back into Wales as Mark Drakeford looks at the restrictions. We continue to see the number of patients in hospital falling at a time where they're talking of bringing in more restrictions for Christmas. And in Wales, where I live, the patients in hospital is at a 3-month kind of low and about 70% lower than this time last year. So we're nowhere near this time last year, Colin, but I think what the politicians and the ministers are looking at is they're seeing Omicron rising very quickly, and they're probably looking at the criticism they've had in the past where they haven't acted quickly enough, and then we've had kind of these big waves. Maybe they're trying to think, right, let's act now rather than be criticised later.
We get that, Jamie, don't we? We get the precautionary principle. We get that they want to be prudent. We get that actually there is going to be a period, and we're in it, when we just don't know. We're in the dark in terms of whether it really is Omicron significantly weaker than Delta, and therefore whether actually what could be 8 times higher the rate of transmission actually then translates into actual hospitalisations. We're all crossing our fingers, but we don't know. But I suppose what we'd like to know is whether we are talking about a fortnight, a week, the next couple of days, as to when we begin to get a sense of whether there will be this great upsurge in hospitalisations. Because, increased caseloads, if they don't translate into hospitalisations, it just gets statisticians excited. It doesn't actually make a great deal of difference.
No, indeed, Colin. So I've kind of started tracking now. I've been kind of looking at the UK data majority of the last 20 or so months. I've started looking at the South Africa data just because it's kind of gives us that little couple of weeks, 3 weeks head start. And we've seen this rapid rise in cases in South Africa. But there's that time lag. And I think Chris really said today, we're at that point now where we will see what happens in relation to the actual deaths in the country. So I would say by this time next week, we'll have a very good idea. And obviously, Boris is banking now on this booster rollout to try and solve this problem. We've got some data now coming out of Denmark. We do seem to get more transparency, I think, in some parts of the world than we get in the UK, which is actually showing that most of the cases in Denmark are among people who are vaccinated. The unvaccinated kind of cases is similar, just slightly under what you would expect when you look at the proportions of people who are vaccinated and unvaccinated. But there is some indication the booster might be helping a little bit there. But this Omicron variant, having booster vaccines, isn't going to stop people catching the virus. If we track pandemics over the last 100 or so, the last 100 years ago and over the centuries, we tend to get these mutant strains that come in that become less deadly but more transmissible. That's probably the big hope. I think what Chris Whitty was saying, Colin, is that even if it's, say, half as likely to lead you into hospital, if you get double the number of cases, that's where you get the problem. But, Colin, the big problem is the NHS is always under pressure every single year. Cancer operations were cancelled pre-COVID because of bed shortages in the winter. So is this a smokescreen as well, that the NHS just isn't being managed properly?
But as you say, hopefully by this time next week, we'll get a sense of how many of those infections translate into hospitalisations. I just wonder, looking around today, Jamie, through the newspaper websites and elsewhere, blizzard of graphs. I'm sure we now get more statistics presented to us than we have done certainly at the start of this pandemic. And I wonder, as a statistician, whether you think, and whether it tallies a little bit with my phrase there, lockdown by stealth, that people actually are a bit keener to be the authors of their own destiny now. We've been living with this virus for quite a while, and people, it seems to me, are more willing to try and calibrate the risk for themselves rather than to leave it to politicians, even politicians with sound scientific advisors behind them.
No, indeed, Colin. I think the big problem we've got over the last 20 months is that there's been this kind of huge panic, and kind of the government have been kind of nudging, and there's a lot of fear. All the newspapers, they love the fact that if there's a big headline, a record number of cases today. One thing that didn't get covered in some of the stories today is that there was an issue with the data yesterday, which meant that some of the cases that would have been reported yesterday have been reported today. So that's in part why the number's so high today, and that doesn't get covered. I think we've had all this huge fear. And on my Twitter profile, Colin, I've been covering some of the kind of not GB News actually, but ITV, BBC, and Channel 4 over the last week, where on Channel 4 they were saying that the majority of patients, nearly all patients in intensive care, are unvaccinated, which when I've been fact checking them and putting them out, and that's not the case. But when people watch these shows, we've had complaints to Ofcom off the back of what I've been saying. When people watch these shows, that they listen and they believe what they're told, and in the main, most of what is said is accurate. But there are some pockets of information being put out there that does scare people. We know people are really worried about things out there, and I think you're bang on the money, Colin, in that people aren't stupid. If people are going to, if you've got your gran or your granddad coming around for Christmas dinner, people will probably be doing lateral flow tests. I've got 2 jabs, I've had COVID. I've taken precautions when I've gone to visit elderly people, and I've checked just to make sure I'm not going to pass anything on. So I think you're right. People are calibrating what the risk is to themselves. And ultimately, that is how we get out of all of this. Testing and testing and testing for a virus. This is never going to go away, which seems to be becoming more transmissible, means we're never going to get out of this if we start looking at these daily numbers of record numbers of cases.
Well, if you're not doing so already, I strongly recommend you follow Jamie Jenkins on Twitter. Jamie, thanks very much indeed for your time this evening. Thanks again.